Welcome to the Unpacked Project.
We're your hosts. I'm Noelle.
And I'm Miranda.
We're here to explore all things social justice. It's through casual conversations, interviews, and storytelling that we hope to inspire others to take action towards a more compassionate and equitable world.
Because honestly, it kind of sucks here sometimes.
For real, we can do better, people.
All right, let's start unpacking.
Ian Siljestrom is the Safe Schools Associate Director for Equality Florida. He is responsible for fighting the extensive risk factors which disproportionately affect our LGBTQ youth in school, including bullying, homelessness, self-harm, and HIV transmission. Ian works directly with 20 school districts across Florida to assist in the implementation of professional development and comprehensive best practices to ensure the empowerment of all students' identities. He has extensive speaking and professional development experience, including at local, state, and national conferences. Ian, thank you so much for being here today. Can you share a little bit more about yourself and how you got into this work?
Yeah, absolutely. And Miranda and Noelle, I really appreciate you both for having me, and I'm really excited to be here. So prior to this role that I'm doing now with Equality Florida, I actually used to be an elementary school teacher. I was a fifth grade science teacher. You know, my undergrad was in science, and my whole purpose was going to be I wanted to get kids excited about science. That's it. That was my plan. And being in the classroom, there were so many things that were happening at the district level, in my classroom, at our school, that I just felt was different from what I ever expected entering into being a teacher. And so it was really that experience, and it was, bringing my identity as an LGBTQ plus person into the classroom, and the fears that came with that really propelled me in understanding, maybe a classroom teacher isn't what's right for me, but how can I start to do some systems change work so that the experiences of our students and the experiences of other professionals in our school districts could at least be improved.
Definitely. Thank you. So before we get started today, we thought that it would be useful to reflect on some facts that call attention to the needs of the LGBTQ plus community. And really, we're focusing on this for Pride Month. Noelle and I were taking a break this month for the next 2 months. And then all of a sudden, we're going to do some episodes to really highlight Pride and just really the community as well. So LGBT youth seriously contemplate suicide at almost 3 times the rate of heterosexual youth. LGBT youth are almost 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide compared to heterosexual youth. In a national study, 40% of transgender adults reported having made a suicide attempt, and 92% of these individuals reported having attempted suicide before the age of 25. LGBT youth who come from highly rejecting families are 8.4 times as likely to have attempted suicide as LGBT peers who reported no or low levels of family rejection. And each episode of LGBT victimization, such as physical or verbal harassment or abuse, increases this likelihood of self-harming behavior by 2.5 times on average. So some really devastating and scary statistics.
Yeah, and these are just some of the disproportionate outcomes regarding suicide and self-harm. But we know that in addition to this, we also see higher rates of depression, victimization, homelessness, the list goes on. Ian, you've taught me a lot about that just from our work together. I've just learned so much about these adverse outcomes, particularly for this community. So some people want to weaponize those statistics and discuss them in a way that posits LGBTQ plus identity as the cause of those outcomes. However, we know that this isn't the case. So can you discuss for our listeners the impact of discrimination and victimization on the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to kind of start with speaking to anyone who's listening. Maybe heard that when you were reading the data, you were saying LGB and then separately talked about transgender youth. And so some people might wonder, well, why did you separate it like that? And so the youth for LGB, lesbian, gay, and bisexual students, that's actually specific to the Youth Risk Behavior Survey here in our state, where we then have national data that talks about the experience of trans students. And so for anyone who wonders, well, why? Why are these separate? Why don't we have Florida-specific data for our trans youth? And that alone should point out to part of the problem, right? We aren't asking, what the experiences of our trans youth are here in our state. So we have to rely on that national data that shows what the harmful impacts of discrimination and victimization can have on the students. And that erasure alone, I think, speaks to what so many of our kids' experiences are in our schools. This is, I love that you all are doing this for Pride Month, and I think it's, anytime we're able to elevate um, uh, LGBTQ identities, I think is so important. But for so many kids that I work with, they'll say, I live in a city that got perfect score on the different indexes that are put out there. And the city does all these things to support us. But that's not what I feel. That's not my experience here in our schools. And so much of this work is incredibly difficult because people are always talking about what we can do in our communities to support adults, but very rarely is that same effort and energy put into how do we support, how do we uplift, how do we empower, how do we support and protect and affirm our youth as well. And so when we talk about the impacts of this discrimination, when we talk about the impacts of this victimization, here in our schools, I always tell people when we do trainings. So we've trained about 30,000 principals, counselors, social workers, teachers, deans, the full gamut of Florida professionals. And what we tell them is being LGBTQ in itself is not a risk factor. It's the societal discrimination, it's the harassment from your peers, it's the lack of affirming spaces, of the unresponsiveness of their teachers. That is what creates the anxiety and the depression and the fear in a child that then would result in many of those data points that you shared. And so, I always am grounded back in the importance of our kids being able to show up and attend school so that they can learn and so that they can grow and so that they can graduate successfully, right? And so, when we think of our kids, the big misconception that we often hear, and doing this work, we get pushback constantly. People are saying, yeah, but how many kids are you talking about? And that's where we are able to circle back to the data and say, this is 18.2% of Florida high school students who identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or unsure of their sexual orientation, as well as 1.5% as trans. So it's a lot more kids than people realize, and yet their experiences are still very much ones that a child should not have to go through to be able to attend school and graduate successfully.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And so, we've explored the term intersectionality before on this show as well. So as a reminder for our listeners, intersectionality is this notion that intersecting or multiple social identities, particularly minority identities, relate to systems and structures of inequity and discrimination. So we know that LGBTQ plus folks of color often experience hostile environments where racism, homophobia, and transphobia are present as well. So additionally, under the minority stress model, these experiences are compounded and can really lead to negative mental health outcomes, such as those we previously discussed. So when we think of societal systems, what should be priorities for schools, social service organizations, criminal justice facilities, in meeting the needs of this vulnerable population?
Absolutely, and I think so core to much of this is breaking down those silos, because people do really, operationalize and do work in very specific fields. And so a lot of the stuff that I get to do is really trying to shed light on this intersectional identities of our kids and help people to understand how you can also show up for students in other ways and other forms of marginalized identities. And so two examples, that kind of oftentimes come to mind is one is when we do this work, we often are elevating GSAs. So previously, a lot of people considered them or referenced them as gay straight alliances. A lot of the language has shifted for them to be gender and sexuality alliances. It's basically a space where kids can come after school and be themselves. And doing trainings and hearing from a lot of these sponsors, what was a very common theme is these clubs were hosted by a white sponsor, and the majority of their students were white who would join into that space. And so we were having to be really intentional about conversations and saying, if you're going to create a safe space, just because you create a space that is safe for LGBTQ youth, LGBTQ identity, doesn't mean that space is safe for all youth. And so being really specific and really intentional on how are you making sure that you're addressing language, how you're ensuring that you're creating environments where kids are able to see themselves and see others and show up and bring all those forms of identities, both identities of privilege and identities of marginalization. And so I think that's a really pressing example that I think of doing this work, but also we do a lot of work related to discipline too. And what we are seeing is our youth and our juvenile justice system, pretty much across Florida, whatever the student population is of any given school district, typically what the trend is showing is if you double that population for the percent who are Black or African American, that is the in-school suspension rate, out-of-school suspension rate, and arrest rate. So in a county where about 25% of the student population is Black or African American, we are seeing in-school suspension rate, out-of-school suspension rate, and arrest closer to 50%. And that is a consistent trend in the majority of Florida school districts. Yeah. And so how we have seen the kind of intersectional identities, this was an example I actually was addressing. And it was almost, it was hard to believe that the adults in these settings kind of lost common sense. And what I mean by that is it was a young female student, dressed masculine, identified as lesbian, and was Black. And so what she was doing was she was sagging her pants, right, in school. And so the first question asked was, okay, so I'm being brought into this moment, so clearly it's been elevated not just within the district, but to me, an outside person. So my first question was, so what happens to the boys that do that? Oh, well, I mean, boys always sag their pants. There's not really anything we can do about it. And so then this is this moment of, okay, so is it because she's Black, they're perceiving this girl as a problem or less innocent? Is it because she's a girl, she's now being dismissed? Is it because she's queer, she's now seen as predatory or inappropriate? All these different things that, I couldn't help but imagine if this child didn't have those intersecting identities. And what we are seeing is the students who did not have those intersecting identities at that school were treated very differently. And why this young person was, the solution was to send to alternative school for a dress code violation, just shown the scale that decision makers are making. And so to your question of what do we do, it really is going to take system breaking work and really honing in on how are these organizations, how are all these social service organizations not serving all of our students' identities? Because if there's any given one of them that they're not meeting the needs for, then that child probably doesn't feel like they can turn to you for those social services.
Yeah, and I think exactly what you're talking about with different intersecting identities. We talk about wanting all of our students to feel safe and welcome in our schools. I think one of the points that you've made previously is 11 staff members in our schools. I think that's like the magic number, to increase safety and make sure that we're being totally inclusive. But unfortunately, we have a lot of students that are rejected or that wind up homeless or on the street. And so according to a recent study from Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago, LGBTQ young people are 120% more likely to experience homelessness than non-LGBTQ youth. And although family rejection is a main reason that's often cited for experiencing homelessness, additional factors also include aging out of foster care, poverty, conflict in the home, and analyses suggest that approximately 20% to 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBT. And within this group of youth, again, when we're talking about intersectionality, some studies suggest that they're primarily youth of color. So what are the impacts of this, and how can our communities better support LGBTQ homeless youth?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you for raising this question. And this is the one where it comes down to families. Because at the end of the day, this is happening because families are expressing rejecting behaviors to the child. Now, are they necessarily kicking the child out? In a lot of instances, yes. In a lot of instances, no. But if they're not directly kicking them out, what they're saying is, uh, you said you're trans, and those words are never going to be uttered again in this household. And so, if you're trying to live in an environment that is that oppressive to your identity, of course, that is why we're seeing more and more of our young people running away. This was definitely something that we saw heightened instances of amidst coronavirus as well. Because for many of our kids, home, community, and school, those are those three places that they can turn to people. And when schools were shut down and community spaces weren't, present, that means it was just home. And if home is that environment that never feel safe in, what is that option for that child? And so, unfortunately, what we are seeing when we kind of circle back to those social services that do exist in Florida, many of them are not being responsive to the needs of these students. And so that will be, shelters themselves that are directly turning away trans youth. That is shelters or foster families that will bring a child into their home. The second they find out they're LGBTQ, they'll kick them right back out. And so, how are we being more responsive? How are we ensuring that these spaces are affirming for them, and that our families, have the tools to be able to raise their child and demonstrate love to their child? When we look at research from the Family Acceptance Project, it gives really clear tips for a parent, right? It gives you 20, 30 plus examples of this is what you can do to demonstrate affirming behavior. And for families that demonstrate that affirming behavior, we see lower rates of suicide, lower rates of self-harm, lower rates of substance abuse. One of those behaviors, right? People, so, if you took a pause and you said, what would some of these behaviors be? And some people might think it's real complex, it's real difficult. Some of those behaviors are literally tell your child you love them. That. And it's like our families are having to be reminded to tell their child that they love them. There's big deep seated issues that we have here, and those last services that are supposed to support our kids clearly aren't doing enough to do just that. And so that's, I would say, an area addressing family acceptance is something that is an incredibly difficult issue because you're coming into a family's morals and ethics and values and all these types of things and how they plan to raise their child. But we're also coming back to what is the welfare of the child, and what do we need to do to make sure that that welfare is met. And so that is certainly something that we're watching closely and trying to understand how to better support the needs of these students in that way.
Yeah, thank you. And I think part of that, something you touched on is how parents plan to raise their child. And sometimes we need to really get away from that, right? Because youth need to have autonomy in deciding who they are and what they want for themselves as well. Just as a side note, Noel, you had mentioned something about 11 like the magic number is 11 staff members in the school. Like what was that referencing, just out of curiosity?
Ian, do you want to elaborate on that for us?
Yeah.
So basically, it was research that was showing when kids are able to identify 11, and it might be 11, it might be 12. So, but around that number, right, a baker's dozen number of people who they can identify as affirming, then it completely shifts the school culture. It encourages the child to stay in school more. It addresses those things related to self-harm and everything else. So it's really basically pointing to, if kids can see that number of staff members based on a sticker or something little, like they're more likely to succeed in school. But here's the thing, Miranda, right? We have conversations with kids. We have conversations with kids, and we were able to sit down with superintendents all the time, board members. And one of these conversations, we actually sat down with a superintendent and 8 students, middle school and high school students. And we said, we knew this research, so we said, how many adults do you genuinely feel you could turn to if you were in crisis? Their number, and these are schools of probably 60 to 150 staff members. Their number ranged from 0 to 2 adults that they felt they could turn to if they were inclusive. And so knowing, 11 or 12 people sounds like a really easy number to get to, but clearly in a lot of our schools, our kids are saying, I'm alone, I have no one, and including in staff. And so it's certainly, how do we start to shape school districts so that they can even just change their perception? Because for many of us, and anyone that's listening, or you all, it's certainly something I always tell people. You know where you're at in your own head, right? Every single one of us know where we're at with allyship. We know the types of conversations we have. That does not mean a student who sees you in a hallway has any clue of whether or not you can be an ally or are an ally. And so how you can start to demonstrate that visibility, how you can start to demonstrate it yourself as someone that kids can turn to, or your school as an affirming environment, or your district as being one that uplifts our kids, that's how you start to change those perceptions. And when we see the opposite happening, right, when we look at some of the bills that, and certainly I can get into this more later, but when we look at some of the bills that are being passed in our House and Senate related to banning trans kids from playing sports, perfect example, that sends a very clear message. And so how, as a leader in your community, in your school district, how can you start to combat that language so that you let those kids know, hey, I understand that that's what passed in Tallahassee, but when you step in my classroom, I got you and I'm here for you and I'm here to support you.
Thank you. That's having worked in a school. I'm like, we need safe spaces. Like,
well, and that's the thing, right? Too,
yeah.
like when we talk about family rejection, I mean, obviously we don't have control over family dynamics and ethics and religious beliefs. We hope we have support staff that reaches out to families and tries to kind of work with them through these things, but we can't guarantee that. But we can try to put these things in place where our staff and teachers and everyone working with students are making this shift so that we can guarantee within our environments, in our school systems where we claim students are safe, right? We maintain their safety, they're within our care. There can't be this, but not for this group of students. And so Ian, the work that you do is super important. Obviously, we've worked together and I lean on you for so much because you're so knowledgeable about it. Because it's just, like you said, you can see students who are in some of these spaces in hiding or don't have these people that they can rely on. And I would hate to think that our schools are a factor that would create rejection when we take the charge of being inclusive for everyone. So.
Yeah. And the reality is sometimes they are,
Mm-hmm.
So earlier, we had discussed some of the harmful impacts that discrimination and victimization can have on LGBTQ plus youth. And so can you explain what social transitioning is and elaborate more on how it can actually be a protective factor when it is supported?
Yeah, absolutely. And great question. So when we talk about transgender individuals, in many situations, we're talking about legal transitioning, social transitioning, or medical transitioning. And so, legal transitioning and medical transitioning kind of sounds pretty intuitive, right? Legal transitioning being you change maybe your gender marker on your birth certificate, your driver's license. Medical transitioning, maybe you're starting on hormone blockers, or gone through some other measures. Now, when we think of young people, and this again, I would say curtails with privilege. When we think of a lot of our young people, medical transitioning and legal transitioning is not possible because it requires a lot of financial support. It requires family acceptance. It requires outing yourself in open court. It requires being able to access affirmative health care. All these different things that we know many kids cannot access. And so what is available? And that's social transition. So social transitioning is being able to use an affirming name and pronouns, dress in a manner that's affirming to your identity, use of facilities and social roles, and things like hygiene products. And so I say the name and pronouns and using a person's name and pronouns is the thing that more often than not is the number one thing I hear from young people. They are saying, I just wish my dean, principal, counselor, coach, parent, pastor, mentor, whomever I just wish they used my name and pronouns. And I think it's so difficult for so many kids because what they see is Jacob goes by Jake, no one questions it, right? Rebecca goes by her middle name Sammy, no one questions it. Franklin goes by his last name Jones, no one questions it. Yep, I got you. Yep, I got you. Yep, I got you. Well, then for that trans student that says, hey, and this is my affirmed name, it's, well, no, we got to go off the birth certificate. It's like, what? All these people in my class, and then this is, why are things different from me? And that why is is known, right? That kid in that moment knows exactly why things are different for them. And so we have to make sure that if we're gonna, I keep talking about and naming, creating safe and affirming environments, using a trans person name and pronouns. And I read this somewhere. It was probably on Instagram, but I don't know where it was. Using a trans person's name and pronouns is suicide prevention. Right? We talk about everyone being able to be trained in all these different things in 8-hour training of identifying this and that. And it's so simple as to using a person's name and pronouns is suicide prevention because it can be. Research from UT Austin talked about how using an affirmed name at home, school, work, and with friends can reduce suicide attempts by 65%. 65%. And that research wasn't specific just to UT Austin. There's multiple research out there that is all pointing to using a trans person's name and pronouns can absolutely reduce suicide attempts. And generally, this is different research from the University of Washington. Just allowing trans kids to socially transition virtually eliminates high rates of depression and low self-worth. So in a population where you shared at the beginning was closer to 1 in 2 have attempted suicide, that can be eliminated by seeing them for how they see themselves. The super, transparent thing that I always talk about, and this connects to the foster care system, it connects to trans kids, it connects to social transition, is what you do at the grocery store when you go to buy deodorant. Right, we know deodorant is a super gendered product. So you either got the very masculine, like a wolf biting the head off of a bear scent, and then you get the super over the top floral scent, right? Those are the choices that we get chosen. And so for that foster parent who has a child, or that parent, that guardian who has a child who's saying, I'm trans and this is the name I want to use, and I'm male, I want you to see me as a man. For that parent to come home with the floral scent, again, it's a really clear message that gets sent to them. And what an easy way to be affirming. What an easy way to literally have no impact on you. Maybe, I don't know, I'm sure there's some kind of price difference because I know that's a real thing too. Feminine products being, exorbitantly more expensive than male products. But still, right? Matter of dollars probably to have a serious impact on your child. But it's not happening. It's not happening. And so the other thing I want to name when we talk about trans youth is 3 numbers. And this is from the American Academy of Pediatrics. So the numbers are 4, 8, and 16. Because a lot of people ask, for a trans person, what is the timeline? And everyone's on a different timeline. But these 3 numbers, 4, 8, and 16. By age 4, kids have an established sense of gender identity. By age 8, trans youth know about their gender identity. And by age 16, it is the average age at which a child discloses their gender identity. And those 8 years between 8 and 16, we can all imagine there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of confusion, and is probably some critical times where family members can be affirming and supportive to their child, and that child is maybe shared it with 1 or 2 people, their identity shared that with 1 or 2 people, and depending on their response, sent a very clear message of, can I share it with more people, or do I need to never mention this again?
When you bring up, some of like just using names and pronouns, or even like you said with Family Acceptance Project, like we just need to tell our children that we love them and that we accept them. It seems so simple. I'm like, I can't believe there's people that will refuse to do this. And now we're here in 2021 with some of the worst anti-LGBTQ legislation. So forget even these, kind of everyday interactions that we can improve, but at the legal level, we have people really fighting to put legislation in place to send this powerful message of erasure and discrimination. The previous record from 2015 was when 15 anti-LGBTQ bills were enacted into law. That was just broken in May with the passing of the 17th anti-LGBTQ bill. And then in addition, we have approximately 11 anti-LGBTQ bills that are awaiting signature or veto, several more that are gaining momentum through state legislatures across the country. So we've just seen a lot of discriminatory legislation, particularly surrounding medical care, as you mentioned, athletic participation for our transgender youth. So, we do know that inclusive practices that allow for social transitioning, just as you discussed, significantly reduce negative mental health outcomes. And the Human Rights Campaign indicates that this fight that we're seeing at the legislative level is actually a fight driven by national anti-LGBTQ groups, not local legislators or public concern, which was surprising to me to learn because I'm thinking, that it's very different than that. But, it's even when you look at Trump voters, it tends to be a low priority. So again, very surprising to me. Like, we talk about our own biases on this show, and that was just, one for me reading that. But another thing that the Human Rights Campaign discusses is that states that pass this anti-transgender legislation typically suffer economic, legal, reputational harm. So it's not really super popular. We've discussed on previous episodes how top-down change and laws are obviously important. It's imperative to send messages for sort of what our identity is as a country, of what we support. But, sometimes we need to take change at a local level and really, use our communities as a way to make progress. So how can people take action to fight for basic human rights for LGBTQ plus people in our country so that we can all live within a culture of inclusion?
Yeah. Um, there's a lot there, certainly. And it's something that, when right now with trans sports ban having been passed through the House and the Senate, waiting for governor's signature, that being signed into law would be the first explicitly anti-LGBTQ bill to pass in Florida in 21 years. And so, this there is a lot of confusion for at least for me. Maybe I'm a little too disconnected, but I'm like, what is going on? Why is this the most anti-LGBTQ year? Why is this Florida is trying to pass the first most explicit anti-LGBTQ bill in the previous 21 years? Why now? What is happening? And so, I think there is a very clear, coordinated movement across the U.S. Because even in our given local school districts, we are seeing a lot of the same messaging. When you look at those different state-to-state bills, you're seeing, if not close bills, the exact same bills. And so clearly, there's some kind of coordination around this anti-LGBTQ movement. But then on top of that, we are seeing that also happening in specifically our local school districts too. So, aside from what happens in Tallahassee, we're seeing school districts pose the idea of doing their own trans sports ban just in their district. Or we're seeing school districts talking about, well, let's just reenact a bathroom ban so trans kids can't use the bathroom, even though the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals made it very clear that you cannot deny a trans youth use of the bathroom at school. Aside from that, even visibility, right? We still have school boards that, when the idea of recognizing LGBTQ History Month comes up in October, it is a very clear no, or has created community backlash, or has created, some districts voting no this year and they voted yes last year on the exact same, resolution. And so, for me, it comes back to voting, and I know that sounds like what probably everyone always says, but I'll be more specific. Being knowledgeable of your school board members, because school boards are a nonpartisan race. And so it's not like you can go to the ballot box and choose based on the party that's aligned with your values. And there are some school board members who, if they're at the dais, if they are elected, the decisions that they're going to be making might be very contrary to what you believe is just and is right. And so making sure that you are truly an informed voter and taking just as critical that presidential race, just as critical that House race, that Senate race, take those school board member races serious too. Because our kids, guess what they can't do? They can't vote. And so we're the ones who get to choose who is going to better or best support them. And so if we want to, support our kids, then we have to be informed and voters and make sure that those board members are able to be strong and positive and affirming and stand up for the rights of our kids, because they do get to make a lot of these very specific decisions that impact a child's experience at school. And so that would absolutely, I would say, be the thing that I would just encourage everyone to please take seriously, because so many people take the first 3 names seriously, and after that, it's just whatever. And our kids don't have that luxury. So hold that to be something that's an important and a powerful decision.
Awesome, thank you. Good, no? I thought you were going to say something. So that actually brings us to the end of our episode. I really want to thank you. I know that you and Noel do this work. It is a little bit more unfamiliar to me. So this episode has been super informative, really taught me some things that I can do differently in my work with youth, even though I'm not in an educational setting, but just letting youth know that the space that I run is a safe space, language to use. So thank you so much. I really hope that our listeners have found value in that as well. So thank you to everyone for listening today and joining us. This month, we're going to continue to celebrate LGBTQ culture and bring awareness to factors impacting LGBTQ rights. In honor of Pride, we'll also be raising money for the Trevor Project, a leading national organization that provides crisis intervention and suicide prevention services to LGBTQ plus individuals under the age of 25. So we hope that you'll join us and support by clicking the link in our bio and donating to help save young lives in honor of Pride Month.
Thanks for joining us today.
Bye.
Show the Unpack Project some love and be sure to like, subscribe, and review our podcast. You can also check us out on Instagram at _Unpack Project.
And if you enjoyed today's episode, visit our website at theunpackedproject.com, where you can make a donation that supports the research, production, and operating costs of this work.
Shout out to all of our listeners who unpacked with us today.
See you next week.
Peace.